Okay, so we know that these oxbow restorations can have a big impact on water quality. I am really curious to hear a little bit more about what you have observed and their impacts on the wildlife that's in the surrounding areas.
Yeah, these restorations can have really great benefits for a lot of different wildlife. So we've done some extensive monitoring and found over 57 different species of fish and 81 species of birds benefiting from restored oxbows. And then that's not even counting all the uncounted mussels, macroinvertebrates, and mammals such as beavers and river otters that benefit from these restorations. So it's really great habitat, and habitat that we've really lost across the landscape. So just returning this and giving wildlife a place to be is great. You talked about the water quality. People wonder, isn't that water quality bad for the fish and everything? Well, we've actually studied that, and we found, at least for the fish that we're targeting, this little minnow called the Topeka shiner, it's federally endangered, they can actually handle the poor water quality. They just need the habitat. So it doesn't matter that the cattle in there making very turbid water, which means there's a lot of sediment mucked up. It doesn't really matter that there's E. coli and animal waste in that wetland. The fish can handle it. They just need the habitat. And then finally, we see really interesting relationships between birds and cattle. So in one thing, there's a lot of different bird species that actually benefit off of the shorter grazed grasses. They're more attracted to that. So there's particular birds that will be attracted to this setting, especially now that there's a water feature here. Another thing is, of course, the manure attracts lots of different types of bugs, which attracts more birds. And so it is a really great habitat setting that we've created in this pasture. So besides the water quality and the wildlife benefits, I want to learn more about the floodwater potential. I know these are kind of small on the landscape, but maybe if we get enough of them across the landscape, it kind of adds up. I want to hear what you've learned.
Sure. So that is a great question, because a lot of times we think of a small-ish feature like this as not being really capable of holding a lot of water. But when you look, our creek is on the other side of it, and we're kind of in the floodplain right here. And so not only is that oxbow now able to store a little bit more water than it would if it were just filled in, this floodplain is really great location for additional big flood storage as well. So these get access, and the cool thing about the flood storage and the wildlife connection is that they stay wet. The floods recede and the floodplain would drain out, but those oxbows stay wet because they fill up, and then they have a slower leak back to the creek. So that allows that water to be stored, kind of shave some of those really high peak discharges that we might see. And you make a great point that if we have a lot of these throughout the landscape, one by itself is probably not going to make much dent in our flood reduction strategies, but lots of them distributed around the landscape have been shown both in agricultural settings like this, but even in urban and more built up places can have really big impacts when you have a lot of them, even if they're small. So they work together in that way. These may feel like a somewhat unique aspect of our landscape, but they're actually quite common, and relic oxbows might be in many places where we didn't know they existed. So I'm really curious, you work all across the state of Iowa. What has been the kind of uptake or the receptivity of farmers and other landowners to doing projects such as this?
Yeah, this has been a really easy practice to fit in with the farming landscape of Iowa. For one thing, it doesn't take land out of production. So it fits really nicely within the landscape. Often it's in these marginal lands or in pastures that they're getting wet anyways. Mm-hmm. They're not using it for any other reason. And in fact, it can be an enhancement by us restoring it. And so we found that farmers want to do the right thing. They like doing stuff to improve water quality, and often like having the wildlife benefits too, especially if they're interested in fishing or hunting. That just really enhances the recreational value too. So it's been a pretty easy sell. We come at it with 100% funding often, or for sure up to 75% funding, and a lot of great technical support to make it easy for the landowner. So we try to make it a painless process.
Great. So if a landowner is interested and willing to do this, what are some of the things that you have found, some of the lessons learned, if you will, that make a restoration such as this oxbow really successful? And maybe let's start from kind of the landowner's perspective, what are the things that they are looking for and what makes it successful in their eyes?
So for one thing, immediately after we restore it, it would be best if they could fence the cattle out of the restoration area. It's all disturbed ground. You know, we want to give that vegetation a chance to really establish and stabilize those banks before we have cattle coming in and utilizing the wetland. So that would be our first, you know, if possible, recommendation. After the wetland is restored, as you've already mentioned, we would really recommend that landowners fence the cattle out of the stream if possible. You know, the cattle already have this great watering source that's out of the stream that's so much better for water quality. So we really recommend for stabilizing the banks of the stream and keeping good water quality, if you can, fence them out of the stream. If possible, we recommend the landowner implement a conservation grazing plan. You can do that with your local NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service office. And basically what we're getting at is just making sure you're not overgrazing, making sure that you have enough vegetation for the number of cattle you have out here. That'll help ensure the success of the wetland, but also make sure that you've got enough grass and, you know, forage for your animals. Overgrazing can be linked to sediment erosion and bank instability, and so that will really, it could have negative impacts on the wildlife that depend on this wetland. So making sure we're grazing in a sustainable way would be really great for the success of the wetland. And then finally, we often have this connection, either natural or built, between the wetland and the stream, so that when the stream comes in, that's how fish and wildlife and excess floodwaters get into the wetland. This could be kind of a vulnerable area if cattle are walking over this connection. So if possible, either trying to stabilize that area with riprap or some other type of bank stabilization practice, or just fencing the cattle out of that area to make sure that they're not making that connection too deep to actually drain the wetland in the future.
That makes a lot of sense.
So those would be some of the first recommendations we would make. Of course, none of those are required, but you know, if we want it to be as successful as we can, those would be some simple things that we would recommend. So this is such a plethora of opportunities across Iowa for these oxbows. How do landowners know if they have one and that it's an opportunity for them?
If you look at your own land and you kind of look at some Google Earth images, you can see the relic versions of these C-shaped kind of wetlands, and sometimes they look like ponds, and sometimes you can't even see them just by walking around, but they have squishier, wetter soil, and the type of vegetation is really visible from those aerial images. So you can kind of see where those former creek bed or riverbed sediments used to exist. What you can do is think about places where grass grows really well and where it maybe doesn't, or where your crops grow really well and maybe where they don't. And those places where they're a little bit more marginal production could be because it's extra wet. It stays too wet in the spring, and those might be old relic wetlands. They might be an old oxbow, kind of like this, or it might be a depressional area that could have been a former pothole or something like that. And so there's options within both of those kinds of practices, or even prairie plantings and things, to be able to kind of take that marginal land and turn it into something that has different multiple co-benefits that you could do. So if those are things that you observe on your land, there's lots of ways in which we can do that. And I'd like, Karen, what are some of the things that farmers can do to kind of access and get support for something like this? Because it's a pretty novel and new practice, and I'm sure there's a lot of technical support, but also maybe some programs that they could tap into to help with the costing part of that.
Absolutely. There are a lot of programs and pots of funding to help landowners install oxbow restoration. So there's a lot of state programs. You can work with the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, especially if it's like a tile-fed, water quality benefit type wetland. Federal government, you can work with the NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service. So stop by your local NRCS office and see what programs they have. They have a lot of different funding pots for these type of restorations. And then private companies such as the Nature Conservancy is also funding these across the state. So best bet is either reach out to me and I'll get you in the right hands and make sure we get the right funding pot that's best for you, or stop at your local NRCS office.
Sounds great. Thank you for all of that information. It's been a great afternoon out here in this beautiful oxbow setting. The cows have gone away, and so we can't really see them anymore, but they have not bothered us, which is great. Thank you so much for all that. That was really wonderful.
Thank you, Sarah.
Great.
It's been great.
Yeah, likewise.